Hey there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, Johnny Blues, and this is going to be a brief little review/discussion video on The Dark Knight Rises, the epic final chapter of Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy. Let me first preface this by saying I'm somebody that loves most, if not all, of the various incarnations of Batman that have featured on the silver screen, from the 1960s Adam West version, which was ultra campy, to the somewhat darker and more brooding Tim Burton Michael Keaton version from the early 90s, even the first Joel Schumacher outing with Val Kilmer in the role Batman Forever. And of course it should go without saying Christopher Nolan's trilogy is right up there with those for me. And I think largely what makes this take on Batman so fulfilling to audiences is the realism Nolan definitely intertwines with fantastical, as well as the myriad depths and layers he wraps his stories in. I really feel that this speaks to a wider range of film goers than just those looking for the usual summer blockbuster comic book movie fare. And in looking at this final chapter of Bruce Wayne's saga as Batman, as portrayed dually and with mastery by Christian Bale, my first question was, how do you successfully and satisfyingly end the commingled sagas of Bruce Wayne and Batman, following up on the heels of what has come before in Batman Begins and The Dark Knight? Well, you begin by reminding us of the crux of the major element of the story, which was the fall of Harvey Dent, or rather, Batman's taking the fall for Harvey Dent. The party at which we refamiliarized with all of this, not only allowing us the awareness that 8 years have passed since then, but also ushering in the debut of Selina Kyle, aka Catwoman, as portrayed with suavity by Anne Hathaway, but not before also introducing us to the enigmatic master manipulator and mercenary that is Tom Hardy's Bane. And subsequent to this unravels the story of Bane's bringing his reckoning to Gotham as a sort of fulfillment to the legacy of Ra's al Ghul, Bruce Wayne's former mentor, and the man he fought to stop destroying Gotham once before in Batman Begins. Along for the ride, we're introduced to those old familiar faces, Alfred as portrayed by Michael Caine, Lucius Fox as played by Morgan Freeman, and James Gordon, owned wholly by Gary Oldman. All three of these guys having knocked their performances right out of the park once again. But we're also introduced to several new faces as well, the aforementioned Selina Kyle and Bane, as well as Marion Cotillard's Miranda Tate, Joseph Gordon-Levitt's police officer John Blake, and Matthew Modine's Detective Foley, which I have to say I thought was a hilarious coincidence in that the actor, once known as Private Joker in the film Full Metal Jacket, now essentially plays a rival to Batman in this film. It was also something of a pleasant surprise to see that his character too had somewhat of an arc in the film, going from being such a rival to his coming to terms with and eventually being on the same page as Gordon in the fight to take down Bane's army. And so before I move on from this point, I want to point out that this isn't going to be a full-on in-depth review of every little nook and cranny of the story, but that what I will be speaking about will still be thoroughly spoilery. I'd say it would be pretty necessary for you to have seen the film to get the things I'm referencing, and if you haven't, well, you're taking a big risk having that all spoiled for you, basically. I am going to be approaching this in the same sort of manner that I did my Amazing Spider-Man review, as well as that of my Avengers review, going down a sort of cast list and point by point talking about the actor and the character as it plays out in the story and stuff like that. So if you will be sticking with me, let's rock and roll. And I'll be starting with Christian Bale's Bruce Wayne. Bale is such a class act in these movies, and I really bought into his sort of fall from grace, his brief return before having his ass handed to him by Bane, and the subsequent and necessary rise from the depths of hell to fulfill his own destiny as Batman, the ultimate sort of bringer of hope to Gotham. His path is racked with uncertainty and anger, and there are moments when we're led to believe that this anger over the loss of Rachel Dawes at the hands of the Joker, and losing the battle that came to fruition with the madness driven into Harvey Dent, that it will well and truly kill him, if not in some way by his own hands, then perhaps by Bane's. All of which I found a very heartening and effective part of the story. Moving on to Michael Caine's Alfred, spinning off from that, this gentleman too is a class act, let me say, and let me forego using that term for all the rest of the players in the films, because I think the same can be said for each and every one of them. They are all class acts as far as I'm concerned. But this guy's arc in the film really just broke my heart. I mean, it's all that he can do to hope that Bruce will one day move on from his self-appointed duty, or is it self-inflicted punishment as Gotham's great protector? He looks at Bruce as a father does his son and wishes him the entire world, a fact that was very hearteningly touched upon by Alfred's tale of trips to Florence and wishing each time that he would look across the crowded tables and hope beyond hope to see Bruce there with a wife and a smile, meaning that he'd made it, that he was happy. This really touched and affected me, especially when the relationship comes to a head in the film, and Alfred tells tells Bruce that leaving is all he has to make Bruce understand the weight of this situation. It's sad, of course, but it's only made that much worse when Alfred, in trying to reach him, makes known the truth that Rachel Dawes had chosen Dent over him in The Dark Knight. And this essentially forces Bruce to cast this man, this father figure, out. When he appears again in the film, it's just at the end, and it tore at my emotions to see him sobbingly apologizing to the gravestones of Bruce Wayne's parents, saying he'd failed them. I so didn't want this movie to end this way, and I'm happy to say that it actually ended on a happier note, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take a little aside and say I absolutely love the sequence where Alfred has to tap on the piano keys to enter the hidden entrance to the Batcave in Wayne Manor. I felt that was a total homage to the 1960s Batman TV series. I may be wrong, but I absolutely loved that. Moving on to Gary Oldman, he has, in my estimation, become Jim Gordon, at least for me. He owns this role, as I said earlier, and the Jim Gordon in this film is definitely carrying the battle scars of the lie he's had to live for the last 8 years. A lie it seems he's willing to resign from his job for in order to break free from, if only he had the courage enough to deliver his speech before Bane's eventually using it against the people of Gotham. But then, if he had, he wouldn't be around for the rest of the story and be such an integral role, so I'll forgive him for it. But I absolutely loved that. As a reward for this, in a sense, Bruce lets him know by the end, using one of those several tips of the cowl, if you will, to Batman Begins in the film, that he's been Batman all along. I thought that was such a great payoff, that here Jim Gordon, he's desperate to know in those final moments who is Batman, and it all comes full circle in that moment. I absolutely loved that. Well worth the reward, I would have thought, for just how true to justice Jim Gordon has been. Getting back to Anne Hathaway, I have to say, she didn't have a whole lot to prove for me in her portrayal of Catwoman going into this movie than she did for some. And I'd say that's because I've basically seen her in other movies where I knew, based on her performances in those films, she could definitely bring something wonderful to the role. And I think by the end it's safe to say she did so. I mean, with this striking suavity and cunning precision does she execute the cat burglar side of the role, and she also shows an amazing ability to change her demeanor on a whim as the circumstances necessitate, doing so with such effectiveness that I knew I was watching Selina Kyle from the get-go. I have to say I loved the fact that there's this great parallel between she and Bruce in the movie, both of them coming from sort of different directions, but in the end, the goal is the same, even though Bruce isn't necessarily aware of that until he's met John Blake, which is at least my estimation, but that being a fresh start, being able to start over freely, and you have that between them. I absolutely loved the interplay between them as well, I have to say. I especially loved this scene, which I refer to as being a reference to Kingdom Come, because essentially you have Batman and Catwoman having just escaped Bane's goons via the flying bat machine, and amidst the rooftop discussion you have Selina slipping off into the shadows. Bruce turns around to utter, "So that's what that feels like." Absolutely called back to me that moment in Kingdom Come where Superman effectively does that to the aged Bruce Wayne. I just thought that was really cool to see that on screen. And I also have to point out, I guess, basically because Catwoman in the end takes out Bane, that effectively means that Batman gets to sort of end his saga with his hands free of blood, which I just thought was really cool. Essentially, he hasn't taken any lives. That whole little bit about her not feeling as strongly about using guns was just pitch perfect for the character, I felt. Now, moving on to Tom Hardy's big bad Bane. This guy is just simply brilliant, I have to say. The entire film, he's got this mask on his face, and so there's nothing in the way of facial expressions for him to use, showing just how big of a threat Bane can be. And yet, the way he utilized his voice, the inflections and the strain he used in his line delivery, the way he carries himself physically, it all just adds up to him having such a confidence in his every pursuit. And to me, that made Bane not only enigmatic, but definitely charismatic and horrifying as a villain. It's with great thanks to both Hardy and Nolan, I think, that we have a big screen Bane finally to wash away that abortion of a poor excuse for the character in the Batman movie that shall remain nameless, in this review at least. And what is a portrayal of Bane without the backbreaker move? I have to say it was a sight to behold. It was such a viscerally satisfying moment because this meant, as of right then and there, all bets were off. It was thoroughly, no pun intended, impactful. And of course it follows on Bane's leaving Bruce in the underground prison, that he must eventually climb out of. But as we find out in this movie, Bane, as big as a threat as he is, he's still no more than a figurehead to Ra's al Ghul's legacy. And thus we move on to Marion Cotillard's Miranda Tate, aka Talia al Ghul. Even though I'd gone into this film already knowing that to be the eventual revelation, I have to admit to being thoroughly impressed with how it was carried out. The allusions to the child that came out of the pit having been Bane all along, when in reality it was Talia, I just thought that was a masterstroke. And the fact that Bane is her protector the whole time, again, just perfect. Now, it got to the point where this revelation came so near the end of the movie, I'd actually begun to think it probably wasn't true, that maybe Miranda Tate was in fact just Miranda Tate and not Talia. So when you have this revelation, it was just perfectly executed for me. And I'd have to wonder if this was actually something Nolan chose to do for that very reason, knowing that audiences already suspected she'd be Talia in the end, so he'd basically hold it off on purpose until the last possible moment. And to me, that's just a perfect example of how masterful this guy is as a director and a storyteller. And the role itself, Cotillard pulled it off convincingly enough for me, definitely. She was very much the confident businesswoman sent in to hedge the bets over the manipulated, thuggy power broker Daggett to secure the reins of Wayne Enterprises, and retain that edge of confidence even when she could have easily been turned into a damsel in distress when Bane captures her later in the film. She convincingly carries that confidence right up until she lets her true identity be known, which was then that she showed effectively just how ruthless and viciously calculated a woman she could be as the daughter of Ra's al Ghul. Now, moving on to Morgan Freeman's Lucius Fox, it was a delight seeing him back as well, and I was really happy that we had another sort of cue to James Bond moment between he and Bruce, him showing off the latest tech goodies acquired by Wayne Enterprises. I love, too, how he's trying to set Bruce's sights on the, air quotes, lovely Miranda Tate, as Alfred does earlier in the film. It just shows that these two guys really have what's best for Bruce in mind, as he says. And there are a lot of other things, too, nods of the cowl, as I referenced earlier in the film, as well as guest appearances that I just loved. I mean, the references to Batman Begins while Bruce was in the prison, once housed by Bane. We get this great glimpse of his father coming down into the well that he fell into as a child, calling back to that whole great theme of Begins, why do we fall, so we can learn to pick ourselves up again, as well as very literally seeing Liam Neeson's Ra's al Ghul again, set as a taunting hallucination that becomes one of the reasons Bruce ultimately is empowered to leave that pit. Not only that, but we also saw the return of Cillian Murphy cropping up once again as Jonathan Scarecrow Crane, as the sort of judge and executioner of Bane's pseudo-government. And I also have to give a little shout-out to Bern Gorman, a Torchwood alum who basically plays the sort of muscle man Philip Stryver to Daggett, who sadly didn't live far beyond his exile on the ice at the hands of Crane. And honestly, I'm sure there are plenty of other things that I loved in this saga's final chapter, but rather than keep you guys here all night, let me move on to the last leg of my look at this film. Maybe by now you're wondering why I haven't mentioned all that much about Joseph Gordon-Levitt's role as John Blake in the film. And essentially the reason for that is because I felt it was somewhat better suited to coming after the resolution of the question I had at the beginning of the discussion: how do you successfully and satisfyingly wrap up the commingled sagas of Batman and Bruce Wayne in this particular universe? To me, it was done deftly and perfectly. You allow Bruce Wayne to end his burdened life, but without actually killing him. You throw in a love interest that is emotionally on par with him, as we see in Selina Kyle, and even a potential successor, handpicked by Bruce himself, just for good measure. That being, of course, JGL's Robin John Blake. Yeah, I know, Robin, groan. But seriously, I was really taken with this cat's arc in the film. Here's this orphan who could deduce Batman's real identity because he could relate to Bruce Wayne, in effect, and recognize that sort of same fake expression he used time and again in dealing with folks who just didn't understand what it felt like to lose one's parents so young in life. I loved how closely this whole aspect was inspired by different comic book characters, and that it successfully, to me at least, took on a whole life of its own in this film. It's intriguing to me that Bruce would gift to this young man the legacy of Batman in the end, too, because in a sense it gave both men something they longed for. For Bruce, an end to his journey and the satisfaction that his symbol would live on beyond him, and for Blake, the chance to be that symbol, to keep Gotham under his protection. And in the wake of this, I've seen it all over the internet, I'm sure you have as well. Since this film came out, people have posted myriad fan-made images and speculated rumors that Gordon-Levitt would go on to play Batman Batman in a follow-up film or even become Nightwing or even be Batman in the proposed Justice League film that eventually may be made. And largely I feel like the folks suggesting this are really missing the point. Those final shots of John Blake staking his claim to the Batcave aren't meant to serve as a precursor to another movie, nor a set of movies. They're largely meant to serve, I think, as a fulfillment of a symbol, of a legacy, much in the way that we saw a large group of people coming together to see Ra's al Ghul's legacy be fulfilled. We finally see in the end that it's Bruce Wayne's to be fulfilled instead. That the Batman, the Dark Knight symbol and beacon of hope to the people of Gotham, will continue to thrive in his absence. And as that symbol, I think it should remain, lest it be diminished by delving into a whole new saga set within the walls of this one that is well and truly complete by this point. And let me tell you, what a way to go out. As we see John Blake discovering that cave, intercut with it is a scene calling back to Alfred's earlier fantasy of visiting Florence and wishing he would one day look across the crowded patrons and set his eyes on Bruce, sitting at another table with a wife and a smile, indicating that he'd made it, that he'd found happiness. The grin Bruce was wearing in this final scene in the movie, sitting across from Selina Kyle, somebody he basically is on par with emotionally, as I stated earlier, the both of them having started over effectively, was no match for the grin that I had on my face watching the scene unfold. It was just a perfect ending to me, and that is the perfect ending for this saga, I really felt. I've heard people refer to it as radical, and I don't see where that comes into play because it was very befitting. Bruce Wayne has moved on, and he's left his legacy behind in the capable hands of a younger man who has the same determination he had from the get-go, and you have Alfred seeing his wish come true. That was just the best way to end this saga as far as I'm concerned. And with that, I can say this saga is well and truly complete, and not only that, but I loved it. Now, I don't know if I'll ever be able to say whether any of these three movies are better or not than the others. For me, all I can say is they all lived up to the standard and quality marked by the master direction of Christopher Nolan, and the actors showcased in the movies totally lived up to what they needed to. I was thoroughly impressed with it. That's all I can really say. And at this point, I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments below. You know, what did you think of The Dark Knight Rises? What did you think of it as a final chapter? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Do you still prefer a different big screen version of Batman to this version? Tell me all of that, what you think about it down below in the comments, of course. And otherwise, that's going to be pretty much it for me on this one. So I'll catch you later. Peace.